Hello, everyone. I'm Alana,
And I'm Illy.
and this is Art.
Hypothetically.
Yay! Welcome to the first episode of our podcast that we very randomly decided to start, but are very excited about.
Yeah, we decided to take a break from making art and we want to talk about it.
Yes. So, in this series of podcast episodes, we're just going to be taking a look at art and what it is, and talking about different types of art, and talking about our personal experience as artists. Just, a bunch of different random fun things. But in the first episode, we wanted to explore the idea of what is art.
Yeah, we're getting philosophical right off the bat.
Definitely. Well, before we jump into what we are going to be talking about today, I feel like we should probably introduce ourselves and give a bit of information about who we are and what we do. So, Illy, would you like to start off?
My name is Ileana. Everybody calls me Illy. You're welcome to choose whichever you prefer. Um, and I have an associate's degree in photography and a bachelor's degree in graphic design. I really love painting with acrylics mostly. I will do just about any form of art or learn if I want to. Is that what we're going for here?
I mean, I think that was wonderful.
Okay, go for it. Tell me about yourself, Alana.
Oh, okay. So I'm Alana, and I am basically a video editor, videographer. I have a bachelor's degree in film and television, which is being put to so much good use right now. I am basically your resident video person. I have also dabbled a bit in photography, but I wouldn't classify myself as a professional like I would classify Illy, in my opinion, is more of the photographer of the two of us. But
That's gonna have to
um,
be a whole nother episode right there. Is
me classifying you as a photographer?
no, like when do you like decide that you are a professional at what you do?
Oh, I think that's too deep for right
Well,
now.
there's okay. I mean, there is an actual answer, and that's when you make more than 50% of your income. I think that's the actual definition. But yeah, we can add that to our episode ideas list.
Well, if we're going by that definition, then I am a professional video editor
Excellent.
because that is what I do for my job. I'm a contract video editor right now, but I also have a YouTube channel where I've been posting videos for a very long time, many years.
Awesome.
This is going so well
So well.
already.
So well. Okay, so let's just start here with I'm curious how we talked about defining being a professional already, but how do you define art? Like just personally your definition.
I don't know. I feel like that's really hard because it's so different for everyone. But my definition of it, I feel like, is really, really broad. It's just if you're creating something, if you're being creative and you're making something, it doesn't matter what the medium is. It doesn't matter like if you're making something with your hands or with paint, or if you're making something digitally. I think that that is technically art. Like even like writing and all that kind of cool stuff. Even podcasting, I would classify as an art form. um, so if you're creating, I think that that is art.
I have questions, but I'll tell you what I think first, and then we can kind of analyze that. I think I kind of feel like it's making something from nothing. Um, there's definitely instances where you're making something from something else, though. Um, but yeah, I think being able to make something from nothing, I think there is definitely an aesthetic aspect of it too, though.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that kind of takes me to one of my questions for you is if you're talking about creating or just making something with your hands, I mean, there are like that, like mechanics. Are mechanics art because they can build an engine?
I don't know. That goes into the functionality of art. Honestly, people might think that something like a car is art, like building a car. I don't know if that's the first thing I would think of when the topic of art was brought up, but I feel like a case could be made that it is art.
I think that is also very audience dependent. First of all, who you're creating for, how many, like who's seeing it.
Hmm.
And in what context? I mean, context is huge too.
This is all so hypothetical.
Yeah, because like for example, while we're talking about cars, I don't know why I brought up the mechanic. That was just the first thing that came to my mind. But like if you're building a car, and we go back to, you mentioned functionality. If you're building a car and it's art, and I'm totally on board for that. And if you're building a car and it's art, is it still art if you're building a Honda Civic, or is it more artistic if you're building a really old muscle car and putting it on display? Like does the use of the creation dictate whether it's art or not?
This is so up to the individual because people view art so differently. Something that I view as art, someone else might be like, that's not art.
Right. I think that goes to another kind of segue of like art versus having a technical skill. Because I think you could very easily say like the art of something, like the art of mechanics, but maybe it's not art. And
Yes,
is there a difference?
I think so. And I'll go into like my personal experience with grappling with that because it's something that I've had to think about with like my video editing. Like the work that I do that I get paid for is basically just taking videos from clients that are already put together and I'm re-editing them and reformatting them and cutting them down to fit different social media platforms. So that's a very technical thing that I'm doing. I am taking my knowledge of editing and I'm cutting down videos that have already been put together and re-editing them for different things. And I view that as like the art of editing where it's very, very technical and there's not a ton of creativity. Like I still have to make sure that the videos make sense, but I'm not really creating because I'm cutting down something that was already made. Whereas when I'm crafting one of my videos or something that I'm helping to build from just clips that are there and I'm making something with them, that's what I view as more of art versus just using my technical skill. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think though sometimes, I mean, I guess it depends on the content there that you're editing, but sometimes I think it's maybe this is the definition of art. Maybe it's about the story. Because I feel like there does need to be a storytelling aspect to, I'm gonna say all art. I feel like all art has a story to tell,
Mm-hmm.
or has a narrative behind it. So maybe that's the definition for me, because you talk about editing and how somebody already created the quote unquote art, and you're just putting it together in its final form. But if you didn't have the ability to tell that story and make it make sense, then your technical skill is useless. In I mean, not to
Yeah.
not to say that your technical skills are useless. I'm saying in that instance, you're not just cutting and pasting and stitching things together. You're creating something. This is going back to creating something new from something that already exists. The same thing if I took like a painting that was reproduced in a calendar and I wanted to cut out this painting, glue it to a canvas, and expand on it. Me creating art, referencing or utilizing that original piece of art doesn't make what I made any less art, right?
That is true. I mean, I've never really thought about it that way because when I look at the work that I do, it's more of just like cutting out than adding. Because I edit it down. Like usually I'm taking a 20-minute long video and editing it down to 3 minutes, which does take a certain level of skill to still have that make sense to cut something down from something that's so long to something that's so much shorter. But is that art or is that just technical skill?
So that's really interesting. I'm curious about the adding or subtracting thing. I'm trying to think if there's a time where, like, I'm trying to think of other art things that I consider art that would be subtractive instead of additive.
I mean, you could remove it, it could be as simple as just removing things from a photo. Like you could have a photo with a bunch of things in it and you want to take stuff out.
But does that make, I see, I have a strong feel. And this might go back to something that you're feeling with video editing. I have a strong feel about photo editing or photo manipulation, about whether that's art or not, because I don't think taking someone else's art and putting a filter on it means that you created art.
Well, no, I would also argue that that's not art. But like, let's say you're a photographer and you take a picture, and then in editing, you take all those things out of the background. Is that technical skill, or is that changing the art? Like,
I think that's technical skill, because if I were the person who created that photo, I likely would have known from the capture that I don't want these items in there. So that would have been my intent. Or, I mean, maybe that's not always the case. Maybe I didn't catch something, but, you know, in editing, I'm like, oh, nope, that garbage can's got to go. But I don't think the act of removing the garbage can is art. I think the act of framing the photo in the first place. That's
but
interesting.
I mean, do you think that the process of taking a photo, like as a whole, is the art where you take it and then you like color correct it and stuff and possibly remove things from the background? Because that goes into like, let's say you're a photographer and you don't edit your own photos, you have like a photo editor. I don't know if that's a thing. But like for video, let's say I get this footage and part of my job is to color correct it and stuff. Do you see that as two different skill sets, or do you think that if you're a photographer, you should know both?
Ooh, that's hard. Okay, so let's back away from photography for a second. I'm going to make a Picasso reference, because a lot of people look at Picasso's art and they think he didn't have technical skill, and that's not true. I mean, even if what he created was all he was capable of creating, then it's still not true. But he was a classically trained artist who could paint photorealistically. He chose not to, right? So he chose not to create that way. I don't know if this analogy is going to make any sense, but that's where I'm at. So that was a choice. And I think as a photographer, you need to know, there's a saying of like, you need to know the rules in order to know when you can break them. I think that kind of applies to Picasso, but like a photographer or somebody editing, I think most artists in that medium would know both, and they would know when to do it themselves or to outsource. The editing can definitely be an art,
Mm-hmm.
but I guess it depends on what you're editing or why.
How would you value art?
That's a difficult question, or it's a two-sided question, because there's how do you value your own art when trying to do so professionally and make money doing art, and
Mm-hmm.
then how do you value art as a whole, or art as a theoretical concept, or art to purchase. I think those are two different things, even though maybe they shouldn't be. um, we talked about like giant canvases in the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, that are just painted all one color. Or I distinctly remember my first trip to the MoMA. I think it was a fully white canvas with like a red dot like the size of a quarter.
I remember that because I remember also looking at that and being like, why?
Yeah, I wish I could remember the artist or know how to even Google that to get more specifics or to find out why. Maybe there is a why. Maybe that goes back to the storytelling. But I remember looking at that and being like, what, like, why?
Yeah.
why are you in this museum of such prestige? Like, what landed you here? Who looked at this and decided that that had value?
And that just sparked my brain because that goes back to like the whole story behind it, where you said like maybe it has a story behind it that we don't know. And if we knew the story, maybe the piece would hold more value. Like we were talking the other day about how like I went to a museum and I saw like a pile of candy on the ground, and I was like, why is there just a pile of candy on the ground? And it was like in the sculpture section. And I was very confused as to why someone had just put a pile of candy there. Like there was no rhyme or reason to it. And even the plaque next to it, it didn't have any information about it. And so I was like, that's odd. Why is that here? And like I still think about it sometimes. I'm like, that was so odd. So I was scrolling on TikTok the other day and I found a TikTok of this girl explaining the story behind this candy on the ground. And it actually has a really deep meaning to it. And I Googled it to make sure it was true, and it was true. And the candy was supposed to represent the artist's, I think, husband or boyfriend. I'm not sure if they were actually married. And he had passed away from AIDS. And so basically the candy was supposed to be like an homage to him, and people could take the candy, and taking a piece of candy would symbolize how like you lose a piece of yourself to AIDS over time until there's none left. That was what the candy was for. I had absolutely no idea, but my perspective on the piece completely changed once I learned the story behind it, because I was like, that's actually incredibly moving and smart. But I
Right.
didn't know at the time that that's what it was.
Yeah, I've got the article you sent me about it. The artist was Felix Gonzalez Torres, um, and it was an art installation. I agree about the changing changing the meaning of the art, obviously, but also changing like how we value it. But well, see, that also doesn't necessarily increase its monetary value. So there's a whole nother thing of, intrinsic value or versus monetary value. I think either the TikTok or the article also talked about like how it was like a moral dilemma a little bit. So it was interactive. They asked or told people that they could take the candy. So if you take the candy, you're working, towards the artist's intent of slowly diminishing that pile until there's nothing left, as a reference to AIDS. But if you didn't take the candy, you were also making a commentary about how people who are not part of that community or who haven't experienced that type of loss or that illness kind of pass it by and don't, participate or acknowledge or give it its time. But when you saw that pile of candy previously, before we found its meaning, did you still think it was art as an art installation? Like, you were in a museum, so you knew it was an art installation. It wasn't just like you encountered a giant pile of candy on the street and were like, why are you here? So did you look at it and be like, I don't get this, or I don't get why this is art? Because I think those are two different questions also.
It was, I don't get this.
Okay.
Because I was in an art museum, so I was like, okay, so this is art of some type, but I don't understand its purpose. Like, I don't understand what it's trying to do. Which sometimes art isn't trying to do anything. But if you see a pile of candy on the ground in an art museum, I mean, your immediate thought is why? And so I just wondered why. Like, what was the point? And now I understand. But there was not anything in the museum that highlighted the story behind it.
Can artists create art with the express purpose of getting you to question? Like, what if the artist's intent, which I think is a whole nother topic that we're probably going to talk more about, but maybe this is where it starts, but does the audience's experience have to match the artist's intent in order for it to have that value? What if this Felix Gonzalez Torres just wanted to make an art installation to have people walking by say, why? And if that was his intent, and that's what resulted, does that give it its value?
Again, I think value is very subjective to the person. That, like, the artist can always have an intent in creating art, but once it's out to the public, it's the public's. Like, it becomes more than just the artist. And like, the first example I can think of that is when you're watching a TV show or a movie and their intent is one thing and the audience gets something completely different from it. And even though the artist intended one thing, or the creators of the show or the movie intended one thing, the audience got something completely different. And so does that change the value of it maybe to the audience?
Well, I think that also changes how people view it in general. I I watch a TV show called 911 and 911 Lone Star, and one of the actors from 911 Lone Star actually said something exactly like what you said, that you're done creating, once you're done acting and doing and making that piece of television, you it's not yours anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So if it is the audience, do they get to determine its value?
I think each individual person determines the value of the art in their own way. Like, I could watch a television show and think it's the greatest thing ever and draw my own conclusions from it. And then someone else could watch it and be like, this is trash, and draw completely different conclusions from it. So I think value is just a very personal thing when it comes to art and consuming art. And it always will be, which is why you can't say this is worth this or this is worth this much and just have it be the end all be all, like that's what it is, because it's different for each person. Like, even if you think about it in more of a traditional sense, someone might pay like $3 million for a canvas that has like barely anything on it. Like, it has a couple of cool brush strokes, which I'm sure took a certain level of skill and time to put together, but they value it at millions of dollars. And I mean, even if I had millions of dollars, I wouldn't be paying millions of dollars for that, because I wouldn't see that kind of value in it. But someone else does. Otherwise, it wouldn't be selling for millions of dollars.
I wonder if the divisiveness there is like by design. Like, does having somebody look at having a particular part of a population or a group of people look at something and be like, this is trash, and another group of people look at it and be like, this is the most beautifully brilliant thing I've ever seen, does that division drive up its value because now there's a conversation and now people are talking about it?
Potentially, because that can also give it more coverage. It can, if people are talking about it more online, for example, and there's more eyeballs on it, then
Mm-hmm.
that could also drive up the value monetarily or even just socially. Like, if this is the thing everyone's talking about and you want to talk about it too.
That also leans heavily into the whole depreciation of value, because if something is hot, it's a hot commodity, and then it also fades away real quick because it was hot and fast and now people don't care anymore. Did the actual value of the physical piece of art change? No. It's not like a car that you put miles on it. It's just the audience fell out of favor.
Yeah. Or if something becomes like a really talked about thing or really mainstream, then the people who don't like mainstream things might not think that it has as much value because it's more mainstream now.
Right.
So it's just, I mean, you can't define the value of a piece of art because it changes so quickly, and there are so many different factors when it comes to
Yeah.
defining that value. I think the only way that you can define value is when it comes to your own personal view on a certain piece of art. Like, you can say, I really value this, or I don't really value this as much, and that's just your personal thing.
I think we've been talking so much about like what we would maybe consider traditional art, but we haven't really talked about everything, especially value. I feel like that's really important when it comes to things like music, um, and writing and books, because those things, have physical monetary value assigned to them for consumption most of the time,
Yes.
right? So
And
like,
then the things that the true too, the things that aren't priced as high, people might automatically assume aren't as good, or the things that are marketed more towards young adults, or the things that are free. Like, it would be really interesting to have an episode on fan fiction versus published books, because people still look down on fan fiction when in reality I've read fan fictions that are better than published books that I've read, like way better.
sure. Mm-hmm. Way
So that is a very interesting topic that you.
right. Because that also goes back to like value versus not quantity, value versus quality, and like they don't line up with a lot of things
Mm-mm.
necessarily. I think that it goes to, I was telling you about, there's an artist, his name is Marcel Duchamp, and he was an artist of many different mediums, but he also was kind of groundbreaking for found art. Um, one of the most well-known is called The Fountain. It was a urinal that he found. This was in the early 1900s. A urinal that he found, and I don't remember. I'd have to look it up. There was like a word on it, or a name. I think it was Armut. And I don't remember if that was already on it when he found it or if he added to it, but the art was just putting this urinal on a pedestal at an installation or an exhibit and calling it art. I'm curious your thoughts on found art and how much manipulation is necessary, if any. And that kind of felt like it was a, value versus quality, because who's remarking on the quality of a found art? Like, I just don't even know.
I feel like I don't know enough about found art to have a really solid opinion on it, but I do feel like if you find something and you alter it, even if it's in a small way, to make it some kind of form of art, I think it's valid. Like, I think that it can definitely turn into something that you could view as art. But I don't, again, I just don't know enough about found art and that whole situation to really feel like I can super comment well on it. But I think it's definitely possible for found art to be a thing without too much manipulation.
Do you feel like that also lends itself more to the why of it all and the story of it all? Like, does it have the
Yeah.
okay.
I
um,
just feel like if there's a cool story behind it and like you're trying to say something with it, like that's probably when I would click with it more than if it was just an object on a pedestal.
Gotcha. So here, I found the part of the article that I was talking about, and this is an article from artsy.net. I don't want to take credit. These are not my thoughts, but it just said that Duchamp had championed for years the idea of the use of ready-mades, that's in quotes, ready-mades, existing objects taken from real life and modified or recontextualized to function as works of art. The idea at hand of art primarily as a concept rather than an object is what made The Fountain arguably the most intellectually captivating and challenging piece of art of the 20th century.
Again, another potential podcast episode. Art as a concept rather than creating something that might stereotypically be viewed as art is definitely an interesting conversation.
Not all art is physical.
Mm-mm.
I mean, we talked about music. Yes, you can physically purchase a CD or a album, but that's not necessarily the actual art. And does the consumption of art and the modes of consumption of art is really interesting also.
That's one of the main reasons why, like, I had a hard time coming to terms with the fact that I was an artist, because video editing doesn't produce anything physical. It's all virtual. And it's like you can film something. Like, I'm a videographer, and so I think that there's a certain level of skill when it comes to capturing video. Like with photography, you have to have an eye for it. But like, I don't know. I've always viewed in the past art more as something like that you can hold, or like drawing or painting or something like that, that like the stereotypical like versions of art. But then as I grew up a little and I went to film school, and I realized all of the different art forms and mediums, and I started seeing, like, because when you go to a museum you don't see a film section. An art museum, you rarely ever see a film section. You probably rarely see a photography section in most art museums, and if you do, it's pretty small. And so, like, when you're seeing all these stereotypical definitions of art, it's kind of hard to view yourself as an artist when you can't do any of those things, or if that's not your area of expertise. So it took me a really long time to come to terms with the fact that, like, I am an artist. Like, what I do is art. It's just not physical in the way that you consume it, and it's not stereotypical in the way it's created.
That's interesting. I'm curious, did you ever, either on your own or in school, I don't know how difficult it is to do this, or if I'm asking a ridiculous question, but have you ever filmed anything on film?
I have not filmed anything, but I have taken film photos and developed them in a dark room.
Because that was my introduction to photography. I mean, back back in the day, back when I was a wee, uh, no, back when I started, there really, I mean, there was digital photography, but it was like not something a 15 and 16-year-old could ever think of affording. So when I was in high school studying photography, it was all film. And so I feel like that has affected the way that I view art as far as photography goes, because I think of my digital files the same way I do a strip of film,
Mhm.
because it is the raw thing. So that's really interesting that you don't see it as a tangible thing when it's
Yeah.
digital.
It's weird.
Huh.
It's weird. And I think part of it is the way that like my high school experience was, because my high school didn't have any like film programs. They had one photography class. I don't know. I always kind of had like imposter syndrome. And it's something I still deal with, but like imposter syndrome when it came to being an artist. Like I didn't want to define myself as an artist because I didn't think I was worthy of the title.
When I was studying photography, and the reason why I switched to graphic design for my bachelor's was because of how dang expensive
Mm-hmm.
art in general is. Like creating art in general
Oh yeah.
can be very expensive. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. But film photography, I mean, I was really into like alternative processes and like doing pinhole cameras, and I developed my film in coffee for like an entire semester. It was just wild, but it was so expensive, and the way that I wanted to be creating art was that way, was with all the weird stuff and the expensive outdated stuff that nobody serviced or made anymore. Like that was what made me happy. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to make any money doing this goes back to the value.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a broke college student, so I'm just going to switch to graphic design because I just need one tool, like in theory, one tool for that, a computer.
Well, I just talked a lot about how I kind of struggled to define myself as an artist. So, to kind of wrap us up, Illy, do you want to talk about when did you start to really view yourself as an artist?
See, that question assumes that I do.
I mean, I thought you did.
I do, broadly, I do say that I'm an artist. See, for me, in valuing, not valuing, in viewing my own work, I struggle to define my artness. um, because I feel like I need to have a like a signature or a niche or a like I want to be the person you go to for this. And because, like I said in the introduction, I'll kind of dabble in anything, and because I have like I feel very much like a jack of all trades and a master of none, and that's really frustrating. Um, like some people would view that as a positive, and I don't, because I want like I wish I could just confidently say, this is what I can do, this is what I have to offer you, and I don't feel that way. I don't feel like my work is bad, like I'm not talking myself down. That's where I struggle in defining myself as an artist, because I can be like, yeah, I'm an artist, and then somebody asks me, oh, what do you do? What don't I do? I wish I had these highly conceptualized pieces of art. I wish that was something that people would be like, yes, Illy, like that's your go-to, that's your signature, your definition. But instead, I'm like, yeah, I'm an artist. I'll design you a logo, or I'll paint you a picture on some canvas, or I can edit you some photos. I can take your car out of the background of your wedding photos. Like if I'm just taking commission, like if I'm just creating what other people want me to create, like that's where I'm having a hard time defining my artistry, because like I'm not necessarily I'm creative in the framing, not literally in a frame, but you know what I mean, like the composition of artwork and my choice of colors and how I frame a shot or how I paint a painting. That's my creativity, but I'm not conceptualizing as much art from the beginning as I would like.
I think it plays more into, instead of how like when you started defining yourself as an artist, it plays more into trying to figure out what type of artist you are. Because you are an artist, but you just aren't sure how to define yourself as one, if that,
Right.
like, that's kind of what you were saying.
And this is not to say that artists can't have multiple mediums or facets that they enjoy doing. There are definitely like super talented painters who also like rock out in a band on the weekends, and they can, you know, make really beautiful music. So, but then you would say, yeah, I'm a painter and a musician. Not I'm an, like, I feel like the broad term of being an artist is very different than being able to drill it down to what you do.
Well, I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, I like being able to do different things, even if I can't do them all super duper well. I like being able to dabble in different areas. Like this podcast is a new venture for us, and I'm excited about that. Like it thrills me that I'm going to learn about this other creative outlet. And I love video editing, and I really like photography. Like I know I don't know too much about it, but I really like it on occasion. And so I like having these different things. But at the end of the day, my main thing is video editing because that's just what I focused on, although I also really love videography. So that's a hard thing for me, is trying to figure out what within the filmmaking process I want to do. Like I know I can tell you right now I don't want to be a producer. I don't want to be a writer. Like there are things that I know I don't want to do. But I love being on set. I love helping out on set. I love cinematography. I love editing. I love the marketing aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's so hard to pinpoint. Someone's like asks me what do you want to do, and I'm like I don't know. I could not tell you. Like my go-to thing is a video editor, but I have so many other passions and interests in the creative sphere that I can't tell you what I want to be or what I want to do. Like I want to do a ton of different things, but I don't know.
Mm-hmm. I think that also speaks to like I think we talked about this whole episode and never actually said it out loud, but art versus being an artist are different.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like we're defining art, but now we're kind of talking about what it means to be an artist. And like philosophically, I think those are different things. But yeah, it is weird. I think also when you're in an industry, um, your ability to create and what little like box you tick is very specific to having a job and a career outside of being a freelancer or, you know, owning your own business and doing, you know, whatever you want. If I wanted to go work for a photo studio, I would need to be able to present myself as something more specific. And I think that's very like industry specific. I mean, how many times can Illy say the word specific? But you know what I mean? Like you're talking about all these facets of uh, video and cinema, and like I didn't think of half of those as being separate things because I'm not in that industry. So I'm like,
That to that point, like people don't understand that an editor is different from a graphic effects person. Like people think that I am an editor, a graphic effects person, and an audio engineer. And I mean, certainly people can be all of those things, but they're very different specialties within the world
mm-hmm.
of like producing video content. And people don't realize that. They're like, oh, you're an editor, so can you make me these really cool title graphics? And I'm like, I'm not a graphic effects artist.
And I think a lot of times, I was kind of like angry tweeting about this the other day. A lot of times in the beginning of someone's career or in the beginning of someone's journey, it is expected that you do everything
Mm-hmm.
because like that's how you prove your value, or that's how you prove that you're like competent. If you were going to go take a job as a videographer and they didn't have a huge budget and they were just looking to hire one person to do it, they would want that one person to have the ability to record, edit, sound, mixing, all of that, because that's what's within their budget. So they're going to look for someone who's young and fresh and who has dabbled in all of these things so that they can pay them less or not at all, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just the expectation that they're going to be willing to do this because it gets their foot in the door and it gets them experience. Whereas if you were applying for larger companies, they have the experience and the knowledge to know that those are 3, 4, 5 different roles that need to be filled, and they're willing to maybe not pay well, but pay 3, 4, 5 people to do those jobs. And I
Yeah.
think that's a big distinction and a really hard obstacle to get over as an artist.
And I mean, and also like another conversation to have in a separate podcast, but also that ties into it is people expecting that because you're new, you should work for free.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I can't tell you how many times in high school and even in my early years of college, I was told to accept all this work and do it all for free because I was newer.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Oh my God.
that's just so effed up.
I don't know if we want to talk about this right now or if we want to save it, but like there's a whole nother point of this that is so classist that drives me up a wall because I could never take an unpaid internship because I've had to work consistently since I was 14 to
Yeah.
have money. So I couldn't take an unpaid internship in college. I couldn't get that experience. I couldn't get myself in the door. I took one internship that wasn't paid and she just like gave me money for my travel and the food. Other than that, for that one semester, like that the
Yeah.
I could talk about this forever. It makes me so angry. So
Well, we
angry.
definitely have to do a separate podcast about that because
Yeah.
unpaid internships anger me. They should not exist.
Unpaid internships, unpaid work, contests that are for
Oh God.
exposure.
Oh my God. Anyway, yeah, that could be a whole other podcast,
So
but
we kind of ran the gamut on this first episode. I think in general our episodes might be more specific and more drilled down in the future.
yes.
But it's also kind of the nature of how Alana and I talk to each other and kind of how we envision this podcast for us to kind of go off the rails.
Yes, but this podcast is going to be really chaotic. We do have two social media accounts set up. We have a Twitter, and our Twitter account is at Art Hypothetical.
Art hypothetically is too long. I didn't know that Twitter
Yeah.
had a 15 character thingamabob.
You can tweet us there, and you can also, tweet us about the podcast on our personal Twitter accounts. Mine is at _kingbooks_ and Illy's is.
Super inspired 67. And yes, our Instagram, which has currently nothing on it, but we will be changing that possibly before this airs. We'll see. Um, is just art hypothetically. No spaces, no dots, no anything else, just art hypothetically.
So if you would like to continue the conversation or just pop over and say hi, that's where you can find us. It's very weird because I'm so used to having a comment section on everything, and podcasts don't have comment
They
sections.
don't.
All right. Well, I think that wraps our first episode. How exciting! Thank you so much for listening in. We hope you've enjoyed the first episode of our podcast. This has been Alana,
And Illy,
and this was Art.
hypothetically.